think we have a quorum. Should we call it to order?
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Is she ready? Are you ready?
Yeah, she's ready. It's 11 a.m., August 29th. Governance Committee meeting of UCIDA and UCCRC. I'm Costa Bahal, and I'd like to call the meeting to order. Yes? Anybody to move? No? Start? Should we start with the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can we do the roll call? I'm Costa Bahal. Here, Lynn.
Here.
Diane, Dr. Diane Onion.
Present.
All right. Let the record and minutes note that Mr. Dennis Doyle, Director of Planning, is here as well. And the Chair of UCIDA and UCCRC, Mr. Mike Ham, is here also. If I could have a few minutes to review the minutes from last meeting for everybody, and if we could move the motion to approve and second, please, when everybody has a chance to read it.
If there's something that I think is important that we have in the minutes but aren't in here, what do we do?
We can revise them.
We make a
Motion-
motion to amend
I
the
would like
minutes.
to make,
Yeah, yeah.
as part of an old business policy recommendations, I think we did come to a consensus that we really needed to have a separate UTEP for our housing
Mhm.
policy, and that's not reflected in the minutes. So I would like to propose a motion that we amend the minutes to reflect the consensus that was, the governance committee came to, that we would need to establish a separate UTEP for our housing policy.
I'll second that.
Motion approved.
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Sorry.
And then, based on the amendment, I have a motion to approve the meetings with the amendment.
I'll second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Any public comments, Lisa? No? All right. We can move on to the next agenda. I don't believe we need an executive session unless... All right. So I think one of the reasons we're meeting here is the fact that we formed a subcommittee, and Dennis, this is more for your benefit as well, I'm sure you're aware of this, that we would like to understand and put forth a suggestion to the full board on what our role as UCIDA and UCCRC should be with housing and what policy we determine it to be from our perspective. However, we wanted to invite you to understand a few aspects. I would love to know in a separate session, perhaps with you directly as well, or with the group, what you're thinking about and how you're thinking about from a planning standpoint. But more importantly, we are interested in, along with other things, what metrics and what data and what do you look at to make certain decisions. Accordingly, we also can align our task force, if you may, to think about those metrics and data sources and other strategies, in addition to what the committee would think about as well. I'll take a pause there. You react to that. This can be an open dialogue, and you can ask questions.
Do it as succinctly as
yeah.
possible. In fact, I think we spoke about at the last meeting, the new Alice report, which I had not seen. So if you have some insight, that would be really helpful as we're thinking
Sure.
through where
Yeah.
we're
far as directionally what's happening, we know the county exec committed the 15 million. If you have plans or an understanding directionally where you're going, we're trying to see where the IDA fits in with the overall housing issue in the county.
Okay.
If I may just add one
Yeah.
more thing, not only in conjunction with what other factions might be thinking, if you may, but also from outside the county, if you have some reflections, that'd be helpful.
Sure. Well, let me introduce myself. My name's Dennis Doyle. I've been with the planning department for a number of years, as they say, over 30. And I can tell you that the discussion of housing started back in the late 70s and has continued unabated since then. So it's sort of like the war on drugs. You keep fighting it, but hopefully you'll make a dent, but it's not likely that you're going to win that battle. I've advised I've now been through 5 county executives, and I think every one of them, the planning department has advised the county executive that one of the number one issues facing Ulster County is housing. Not only the fact that the cost of housing, but also the availability of housing. And we've continued to essentially make policy changes associated with that. I would tell you that in the last 4 years, starting probably in 2019, with the pandemic, exacerbated, if you go back to 2008 when we had some substantial issues with respect to a crash, those things are really affected Ulster County relative to some of the cost of housing and the availability of housing. And a lack of housing starts, yeah. And what's ended up happening is that we have, in many instances, we have disconnected our housing market from our job market. And that has been, I think, to the detriment of all of the businesses in Ulster County. It's been to the detriment of the availability of a workforce that is ready, willing, and able to work, and it's been really in more back in the 80s and then again in the 90s and now again where we are today, the ability to essentially for businesses to attract even professionals. Middle management is literally priced out. The example I would give you is the county is in the process of hiring or has confirmed the head of economic development department who is looking for a house and has been looking for a house for quite some time. So it's reflected all the way down through. There's a lot of different driving factors on that, and I'm certainly willing to talk about those. But the key in my mind is that if you look at things, wages have not kept up with housing demand. We are essentially, and housing availability has not kept up with the ability of private sector to innovate around making houses less available. And I'm referring to short-term rentals in those instances. There are about 3,000 short-term rentals in the county. Some communities have over 500 of short-term rentals in the county. They have become both an economic force and a political force in many instances. So what ends up happening is the ability to regulate them, although people understand what the problems are, the ability to regulate them is somewhat more difficult with respect to some of the elected officials that are here. And it does exacerbate the housing problem. I will tell you that if you're building housing in Ulster County, you're not building to the housing that we need. You're building to essentially people that are from outside the region in terms of costs. So the projects that we see are literally low-income housing tax credit finance projects, and I'll get into what those are, or very high-end housing starting in the $700,000 range. So we have something called the missing middle. I'm not sure what's missing in the middle anymore in terms of affordability because of what's happened to costs. Costs are a driving factor right now in terms of even starter homes relative to that. We've responded in many instances. The county's just, as Lynn indicated, the county has just passed a program called Ulster County Housing Action Fund. There's about $15 million that is going to go into a assigned fund balance. It's not a reserved fund balance, it's a assigned fund balance. There's some advantages to that for the county because it carries over from year to year, but it's not restricted. The legislature could pull it out at any point in time and use it for any other purpose, should they so desire. The resolution that created that fund also allowed us to essentially set forth the availability, although they did not authorize it, the availability of funding on an annual basis, at least in this year, for about $3 million. And that's going to go out on something called a Notice of Funding Opportunity, NOFA or NOFA. We have draft policies associated with that. We created a local law in order for the county, believe it or not. There are two things that are really interesting from the perspective of county law. The county is not, and I repeat, not entitled to essentially under county law. It's not entitled to fund housing. So we had to pass a local law, and we did so in accordance with the recommendations from a controller's opinion. It goes back into the late 90s, I believe, rather than seek special state legislation. The other thing that you should know, if you don't know, is the county cannot enter in and do economic development. Can't fund economic development. We do have a special state legislation that was passed that allows us to fund certain kinds of economic development defined in that statute as industrial. And so we have in the past funded things associated with that through what was then the Development Corporation, but it's similar to the structure that's here now. We funded infrastructure improvements associated with that. UCIDA, yeah.
And
Yeah.
you still have UCIDA, correct?
No,
You disbanded.
no, UCIDA still exists, but we actually funded it, I believe, through. I think we did fund it through the Development Corporation. You're correct, yeah. So that sits out there, and we funded expansion of sewer districts and water districts in Saugerties. The typical discussion with those is, and from any economic development folks, is we don't have any place to build, so we need to essentially provide green fields with infrastructure. That has worked wondrously not in terms of success.
Just not to interrupt, but just for my benefit, I'm relatively new to the county, only been here about 7 years. I understand you're talking about housing for purchase.
Mm-hmm.
Could you also incorporate some thoughts on, as I was requesting earlier, what do you look at in terms of data, and how do you actually think about the pieces of information that you have, not only from housing for development and sale, but also simply accommodation by way of perhaps renting?
Sure.
Because I think we are looking at housing from a broader perspective, more to have an accommodation versus the ownership of the home.
And I think Coscu touched on that. Actually, Dennis, you touched on that because you said currently the new economic development guy over there, right? The new guy, I don't remember.
Kevin Lynch.
And
Kevin
he's
Lynch, right?
he's not low income, affordable workforce, or very low income housing. He's just looking for a house. So it affects the broad stroke. You know, it affects everyone. So
Middle income.
I agree with where you were heading.
Where's he heading?
He was inquiring about,
I'll explain.
yeah.
Where I'm heading is, I don't want to just focus personally on housing that's available for sale. Because if somebody doesn't have a house to live, the first priority should be accommodation. So where I'm heading is there housing stock that can actually house people? Then we can determine whether it has to be for sale or for rent. Housing stock is not dependent only on
So
purchase. It's about housing for people who cannot live in this
Some
county.
stuff to develop that.
Not necessarily all the time, because I think we do have certain areas where buildings or land is not utilized. There might be a structure on it, and people are just not renting it because, or
They
selling
might
it.
own it though, that's why it's not, right?
Right, but I think it's more about the availability of housing to be able to accommodate, right? It's not just about housing stock.
So let me just sort of, I just wanted to go through some of the programs that the county had. So we do have programs relative to the housing fund that's out there now. We will be issuing a NOFA on that. There are limits on that. We will be forming a housing advisory committee that will take in applications. Those applications will go to the legislature with recommendations for funding. The legislature will make the final decisions with respect to funding. Those are catalyst funds, if you want to call them that. They're not going to essentially build a house or build an apartment unit by itself. They're limited to somewhere in the neighborhood, we're running through the limits right now, somewhere in the neighborhood between $35,000 and $50,000 per unit, with a cap on projects of about $500,000. So
So it's improvements to
no,
existing
it's
homes?
new units. It's focused on new units.
One typically, how big's the site?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. And understand something, the NOFA, what we found from talking to other counties that do this, Tompkins County is one, Westchester County is another, there are other counties that do this. What we found is that the success of these programs depend upon their longevity, because what ends up happening is that the first time you go through this process, you're not likely to have a lot of applications, but as developers recognizing that the funds are available, they start to build it into their capital stack, and think about it in that way. One of the reasons that we think of these as catalyst funds is that when you have a conversation with HCR, which is the Housing Community Renewal Organization, they issue low-income housing tax credits, right? It's an application process for 9% tax credits, which are generally used for senior housing, and then 4% tax credits, which are generally used for workforce housing. When that happens, they look for local participation, and local participation adds points. When you add points, you're likely to get funded. The example I would give you is in the last go-around, remember we had ARPA funds. The county dedicated a certain amount of its funding to housing with respect to ARPA funds. Part of that went to a senior housing project in the town of Lloyd. It wasn't successful in funding an application for 2 years in a row. And when the county committed about I think it was about $500,000 of ARPA funds, the next funding round they got submitted. In the most recent example, the county is involved in a facility that is going to be located on Golden Hill. It's 164 units of housing that is combined for 80 of those units are going to be senior housing. 40 of those, or somewhere in the neighborhood around 40 of those, there's different ways to look at this, will be frail seniors and supportive housing. The other 44 units will be workforce housing. All of those units will be below 80%, with the average affordability in the facility of 60%. So the average affordability, they'll reach as low as 30% of AMI and all the way up to I think 80% of AMI.
So this is targeting that particular group right now that can't rent, that can't buy.
That's correct.
But you've already addressed the affordable housing through those stipends, but if there's no rentals.
So that's what we're trying to do is understand what ends up happening with respect to rentals, is understand the market level. I just gave you 2023 HUD income limits. You can give you a sense of what happened to the county in the last 3 years. I'll give you a sense. The AMI in Ulster County, which is area median income in Ulster County in 2022, was $96,000. That's calculated on a basis of a family of 4. By 2023, that jumped to $112,000. What that means is, just in terms of affordability and calculations, is that when you start doing a 30% number, 30% of we'll use 30% as a affordable factor in terms of rent, right? I will tell you that over 50% of the renters in Ulster County now pay more than 50%, more than 30%.
Pay in the 60 range?
What we call unaffordable is more than 30%. Severely cost burning is 50% or more, and that's around 25 to 30%.
Dennis, so I know data, and I think it's a couple years old, but the income, the gap between income in these numbers and what the rental is, most people in Ulster County can't afford rentals, what they were
What they are today.
That's
right?
correct.
So I'm hearing like the county is doing things around low income, senior, some around workforce housing.
There's,
workforce.
there is
And
nowhere,
the sweet spot is everybody stuck in the middle who
there
just
is
can't
nowhere,
get anything.
there is nowhere near enough.
Right.
I
So
can
maybe that's
tell
our
you that,
sweet spot to fill that gap, since there's other policies and monies and funds flowing to take care of some of these other populations within the county that also need housing.
from my perspective, I think you shouldn't fund anything above 80% of AMI.
Yeah.
I mean, because if you look at where these people are, if you think about this, where people are, anything essentially above 80% AMI, the market can take care of. And the market is now already responding to that. We have housing proposals in the town of Saugerties. We have 2 housing proposals. We have 200 units in Marlborough, about 220 units in the town of Esopus, 130 units under construction in the town of Saugerties, more proposed for the town of Saugerties, and 800 and some odd units in the town of Ulster at the I-Park. So the market is responding. The problem is that response and the rents for those response are not covering anywhere near the 80% of AMI. You know,
Does the county, I'm sure you have the data, I'd love to know, how much housing is needed by category?
you would think that that data is available. It is not. And part of the reason for that is that when you look at housing needs, you don't look at housing needs on the basis of a broader spectrum. You try to look at housing needs on the basis of an affordability spectrum. It's called a fair share plan. Fair share plans in the state of New York are an anathema because developers can sue on them. So what ends up happening is if you have a fair share allocation of housing that you essentially as a community have to meet a certain goal with respect to affordability, what ends up happening is you go in as a developer, you propose it, and then the community says no, which is a typical reaction. When the community says no, you go and say you have a responsibility to meet your fair share. You haven't done that, and then you work on the basis of coming in and going to court with the community and saying, by the way, this is not going to happen. What happened in Westchester County many years ago is they were using community development block grant funds that were coming out. Those block grant funds were basically putting poor people in poor neighborhoods. The federal government came in and said to the county of Westchester, this is not working well. You got to stop putting people in Yonkers and start thinking about Newcastle, right?
That's a form of redlining.
Well, it was. In point of fact, it was. And so what they did in Westchester County is they created a fund, a housing fund. It was in the million, I think it was $50-some million, a housing fund. They also created a housing defense fund, and the feds were actually sitting in on local planning boards, and the town and the county of Westchester actually pledged to take local towns to court on the basis of their zoning statutes as being exclusionary. Not a very popular place to be.
And then nothing
And then nothing gets
gets done.
done.
So I have a question. What do you, Dennis, what would you consider market rate, AMI?
So there is something called a HUD fair market rents.
Mm-hmm.
HUD fair market rents have now essentially have not kept up with actual real rents.
Mm-hmm.
So they're well behind, right? So what I would consider affordable is based on 80% of AMI.
Okay.
So, and then where I think that we need to go if we're going to subsidize housing, it should be at the 60% level.
Okay.
You know, I don't think we should subsidize
I don't.
80% AMI. I think we need to subsidize somewhere at the 60% level.
I'm not sure, I think we're even at the point where we're thinking about subsidizing.
No,
or not.
subsidizing, you know.
Well, the
this
form
type
of subsidy is pilots.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the form of subsidy.
Well, I would say incentivizing rather than subsidizing, because there has to be a.
That's fine. I mean, I won't quibble over verbiage.
No, I'm
you
not
know.
talking about
Yeah.
semantics, but at the same time, I am curious, where can we get, and this is why I was interested in meeting with you, and I'm still interested in talking to you about that. Where can we get the data or information? Where should we look to be able to understand what is that middle income level requirement is? Because we would also, at least I would like to also understand where are those pockets of partly developed or to be developed areas, because individuals who are seeking a housing, they would also like to be somewhere near employment, as you mentioned. So the employment dynamic is not matching the housing dynamic. And if you could shed a little bit more light on that, that'd be very helpful.
Sure. First thing you need to understand is that there's been a sea change relative to where employment is and where housing is, and the reason for that is that you don't have to go to work anymore. All right? You simply can, and what that means is that this county used to have about 1/3 of its workforce worked out of county, 33,000 people a day. Over 12,000 people used to go to the metropolitan area, but basically 33,000 people a day sort of went out of county. If you were in Lloyd or Marlboro or in Shongum and in those areas, 90% of those folks worked out of county, right? So that trend has changed in terms of they don't go every day, but it hasn't changed in terms of their ability to essentially still meet with customers and go on a different scale. I think of this, if you go back to Amazon and Google, 3 days a week, 2 days a week, you have to be in the office kind of thing. Well, that all of a sudden changes the commutes pretty substantially. We had in the past what we used to call week extenders. They would spend 3 days up here and 4 days in the city. Now we have just turned that right around. We've just turned it. That makes things a lot more convenient, I guess, in terms of what you're doing. So what you're fighting is essentially incomes that are not based on Ulster County's wages. That's what we're fighting.
So, Stu, I would think the other thing is if we targeted towns, hamlets, whatever, within the county, that would also be problematic because then we're kind of saying to this town or area, like, we're going to only, and then that I think becomes, I don't know, I think that makes it even more challenging for us as an IDA to say we're just going to focus on these particular towns because that's where there seems to be more growth. I'm just not sure that would be a strategy that we would be very effective in.
It could be
Because
contentious.
there'd be a lot of issues with, I think, the towns and people don't want a lot of these projects.
So-
either,
My short answer is yes. My longer answer is that there are critical development sites within the county. You now have blanket UTEPs that apply countywide. Quite frankly, things are real different in Shandaken than they are in Saugerties. And the thought being, we've always argued this. Matter of fact, we argued it even before we took Tech City in a foreclosure process. We argued that the IDA should consider a geographic UTEP for critical properties and think about that in ways to attract the types of things that you want in those properties by basically setting a UTEP that's based on
Encouraging development.
well, but it's only in those things that are basically under the best thing you can do from an environmental standpoint is redevelop an old site, as compared to Winston Farm, which is essentially going into a green field. The example, and that's why I use Tech City as an example. The other example, it's a really great example out there, is what New Rochelle did. New Rochelle had a crumbling midtown and downtown area. They went through with their IDA and went through a complete redesign of how they would treat that area, changed their zoning statutes, and then basically offered substantial amounts of incentives to essentially move into that downtown area. We're fortunate we don't have those kinds of situations that New Rochelle has, and New Rochelle doesn't have those situations anymore. But the point is, that's the power of a geographic UTEP.
So
we do
these,
have some incentives in our existing UTEP for suppressed economic areas for projects, and we do
Yeah.
give more points to projects who do,
Yeah.
purpose land and also in distressed areas. We do give more, we incentivize more based on that, those projects. It's kind of inherent in the UTEP, but you're saying they've done a really focused.
Oh, yeah.
UTEP.
It's, yeah.
I guess along the same.
You talk about a lot, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to ask one thing. Along the same lines, are those based on certain abatements or, and I'll ask you why tell you why I'm asking this specifically. The delinquency rates that just came out about a week ago or so have been rising quite a bit. And the rates are actually almost as close to that used to be in the last crash. And housing starts, as we know, are not also, those are subjective numbers. So are you thinking from a standpoint that these are abatements or these are certain other incentives that New Rochelle implemented?
New Rochelle implemented two. One was essentially a relaxation of their zoning statute and an increase in density.
Okay.
And the second piece of that was a means to essentially incentivize through their IDA. I think they have a local IDA. A means to incentivize that development by offering substantial amounts of tax breaks. One of the things that we don't know what's going to happen yet is the City of Kingston just passed a form-based code. City of Kingston's form-based code is substantially different than the existing code they had, and substantially more urban than people I think will realize. The allowance, I would give you, the allowance now on Broadway is 5 stories. That's, we haven't seen 5 stories in Ulster County in a very short period of time.
That it would start with the rezoning? I mean,
It's
all
done.
economic development, I mean, you've got to loosen the strings on zoning. And, and
Which
that
they
goes,
just did.
that
Yeah.
goes to neighborhoods. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
right now, I know empty lots that you can't put
Exactly.
anything on.
So one of the things that we've done when we did the housing program out there, so we established when we did this housing action plan, one of the things, the recommendations in the housing action plan was to create a housing smart communities program, which is similar to what the state did with respect to climate smart communities programs. And it's a point system, and we provide technical assistance in terms of consultant assistance. We didn't know how successful it would be. We rolled it out. We now have 11 municipalities that now have housing smart communities resolutions that indicate they would pass. And we also have, we're working with 4 communities right now in terms of providing consultant assistance to amend their zoning statutes. We're reviewing those right now.
Can you share what communities?
Sure, Olive, Rochester, Kingston, and there's one more. I know there's one more.
That's what I was thinking though about we target geographically.
Marbletown?
Yeah, no, I don't believe so, but I'll look.
Okay,
I'll look.
yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the differential is like they have the local IDA, right? So it does require really close work with the towns if we were to take a geographical approach. It just sounds like that would just be a really involved process.
I actually don't think that that's the case. I think that if communities are talking about
Communities that don't resist so much.
communities are talking about problem areas or areas that they want to see redevelopment, I can't imagine that if an IBA says we want to assist you with respect to that they're going to say no.
Can I ask you
You
this?
know,
Sure.
I don't think
Can
that would be
I
the
ask
case.
this?
You know.
About that, we always hear communities always say no to housing projects. I mean, they're usually, or just.
Well, but there's
So-
a big struggle because they can't hire people, they've got
Right.
businesses complaining, so it is a
There's more
crunch
pressure.
on both sides
Ah.
that I think is forcing the towns to look at things differently. So
And you
from-
look at these as mixed-use developments. You don't look
Right.
at, we're going to build X and Y.
Yeah,
We're going to
yeah,
build
yeah.
X, Y.
Gotcha.
You know. Yeah.
So, having said that, is there information you can give us, share with us, about what communities are considering, what what they're talking about with regards to housing that could inform the way in
Sure.
which we would set up a geographical UTEP that says, if
Sure.
they're gonna do this, here's what we can provide in ways of servicing to
I mean,
help you
mean,
realize that.
You have a no-brainer. You have the west and east campus of IBM, the former IBM facility. That's a no-brainer. For me, it's a no-brainer.
And Dennis, just to add to Lynn's, in fact, as a question, I would like to understand, how do you think about picking a certain geography, if that is the way we decide to move to?
I think.
Because I'm not certain.
If I could
Yeah.
dial something back really quick.
Sure.
The campus out there at IBM, East and West, we have to always keep in perspective that the people coming in to develop this, they don't own the property. That's
Right.
still owned by one person. Therefore, the pilot is not going to align with that. So the pilot's gonna be out the window. Taxable bonds, obviously, mortgage recording tax,
That's
so
where
on
we
and so
bumped up
forth.
against with a couple
So-
projects, we couldn't get them off the ground.
Because-
Dennis, and the other
Yeah.
problem, I'll just elaborate a little bit, and I wish Joe Scott was here because he's more well-versed than I am on it. But there is a formula that's the guideline for us as far as the bonds go.
Mhm.
And the bonds, and you know it then,
Yep.
you know about the 30, and the problem is if they're not phasing it out, they're in excess of the money, so therefore we can't even bond them. And
Because they're
just,
over 30 million.
just
Yeah,
recently,
recently,
they
yeah.
just
Yeah.
discussed this on
Yeah.
the floor in Albany to expand it, which has been a long time coming. It's 25 years since they moved on it, so hopefully that'll open some avenues here and help out,
That's right, because we had Zinc 8 and they had to cap it at 10 million and had to be on, capital.
Correct.
That's
Yeah,
right.
it's capital.
You remember that,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
And that's where it started
We-
to get sticky.
But,
We have,
the pilots, I remember we spoke a long time ago, and, well, I don't want to say too long ago, but long enough, but we were talking about the pilot as far as some of these mixed use, low income, affordable housing. And our current, we all agreed that we have to have a separate UTEP, or it's just not gonna, work. But Dennis did throw something out there, which, at the time, it was, boom, it hit you right in the face. Instead of bringing it to maybe you start them at 30 to 40%. Remember, we talked about that on the repayment. And that way, with a developer, it'll lessen the load, plus help him out. But he could always go the avenue of
so,
filing like Penrose did, right?
yes, yes. So a couple of things, I just want, I had to show you this. I hope I brought it up with me. So, we think simple, developers think complicated, right? And development deals are complicated, and you can make development work
Whichever way.
to your advantage. The best example I would give you, whether you like it or not, and I'm not criticizing or endorsing, we have a very, very expensive health facility in the town of New Paltz, which is considered a nonprofit. Go figure. Right? If we can do that, right, to get a health facility in, I think we can be pretty creative in terms of trying to figure out how to work through a pilot situation where there's a single owner. So I wanted to show you this because it gives you a sense of a development structure for Golden Hill. So that will give you a sense of the ability of essentially the private sector to come up with a development structure that allows them to go through a process. So, and I've walked myself through this with notes and everything else. We've provided this to the legislature. I'm not sure what understanding they.
Toledo.
But the point I want to make is you see over on the top side the nominee agreement, Golden Hill Housing Development Fund Corporation. There is a provision in state law, under the tax law, that allows a development fund corporation to be formed with a nonprofit. That nonprofit then negotiates directly.
Leave it to a developer to come up with
Give it to an
it.
attorney to come up with
The-
this.
the-
This is
That
really
develop,
funny.
no, that developer, that once you form a housing development fund corporation, what ends up happening is you no longer need an IDA,
Yeah.
right? Because what ends up happening is under a development fund corporation, you can actually go directly to the taxing jurisdiction. That taxing jurisdiction makes decisions for all taxing jurisdictions. So what ends up happening with, and this is, Kingston is very familiar with this. They've had this structure exist in Kingston for at least 4 deals that I'm aware of, right? The point I want to make is that when you look at housing, the Development Fund Corporation is not necessarily it's not that important. Stony
They're
Run,
workarounds. They're
Stony
workarounds.
Run, for example, which is now, and once you get to,
Is that affordable or workforce living?
no, what they did at Stony Run is think of it this way. My understanding, I have to say this is my understanding, it may or may not be, this is secondhand or third hand. Stony Run Corporation bought the buildings for a lot of money. Then they had to do a lot of improvements. A lot of money plus a lot of improvements means a substantial tax burden, right? So what ended up happening is they realized they couldn't do I think what they did is they realized they couldn't do the improvements they needed to do. So by going through a development fund corporation and creating 20% of the units to be affordable as defined, right, they were able to go directly to the city and say, we'll pay the taxes we're currently paying, then some, and we'll hold our rents in an affordable level. And that's the agreement that they
And
reached.
the improvements are made.
That's what, yeah, exactly,
Right.
and the improvements are made.
Then the Kingston Housing Authority went through the same ordeal.
Similar.
on Flatbush Avenue.
Similar.
And did they put a time parameter on maintaining
Generally-
affordable rent?
I can tell you, I tell you, low-income housing tax credit financing is 30 years. Generally bumped to 40 or 50 years in order to get funded, right? So that's what ends up happening. The pilots that are signed, I also want to say that the pilots that are signed to low-income housing tax credit projects are there for two reasons. One is, remember, there's a section in 581A, I believe it is, basically says that because your rents are fixed, you don't pay taxes based on the value of buildings. You pay taxes based on the value of your rents, right? And that's based on profit. The problem with that, it sounds well when you think about it, the problem with that is, A, people can manipulate profit, and B is, investors don't like the fact they don't know how many taxes they're gonna pay. So most,
We heard that in
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Give us the
Yeah.
schedule.
Well,
Most-
finance, they can't get financing.
Yeah.
without
right,
that.
so most developers of affordable housing basically go the pilot route through a development fund corporation, and that's where the discussion goes back and forth. The key to remember this relative to a standard pilot is they're entitled to essentially to be taxed on profit or value, not on the value of their buildings. So it's an entitlement. So just be aware of that.
So one thing I'll grab attention to what you said, when you're looking for who owns the land or whatever, you get pretty inventive. And
Well, that's-
recently, there was an article just released here last week. Did you read it about Dutchess County IDA released that? Sarah Lee did it over there. Did you see the last sentence of the last paragraph? The reason it moved ahead, a lot of the reason it moved ahead, it was also deemed a resort destination, which puts you right into the parameters.
Of the idea.
But I'm thinking if we run into issues with I'm thinking if we run into issues with respect to Tech City, we can find an ownership structure that you could fund.
You know,
That's why I put that out there. I mean, for me, whether it's, I'll give you a sense that the county does this as well, right? The town of Ulster owns the site where we built our fire training center. We have an easement over it for fire training purposes. So you can think where the underlying land remains in the ownership of I-Park, and the building is owned by somebody else. So, there's all kinds of structures that you can think about, and I would just urge you to, in terms of saying to you, well, why don't you get creative to some of your applicants with respect to that? It's not, everybody looks at this as we're trying to scam somebody. We're actually not. We're trying to get people a benefit that they're entitled to if they were an owner. They just don't have a place where they can be an owner. And you're getting, the community benefit is we're getting
Getting jobs and you're.
well,
putting
we're getting a
housing
site that's
in,
sitting there vacant right now.
Yeah.
That's for me. Let me just sort of, you've asked me some questions with respect to numbers. There's something called a Housing Choice Voucher Program. The Housing Choice Voucher Program is essentially, you're entitled to a house or an apartment. You're getting a voucher from HUD that says, I can only pay 30% of my rent, but the federal government will pay the rest up to the fair market rent, right? We have in the county right now somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,800 to 2,000 vouchers, which is essentially 2,000 affordable housing units. Think of it that way, right? We have probably over 100 individuals who made it to the top of the class, and they can't find, they have a voucher,
They can't.
but they
use it.
can't
Yeah.
use it because there's no apartment rented at fair market rent, and they can't pay more than 30%. So they go try to find an apartment, and it's a real problem.
And that circles back around with maybe your short-term rentals.
Yeah. So a
Yeah,
couple of
but
things.
That has always been one of the.
Yeah, but now it seems like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not unsympathetic to anything that goes on with housing at all, but, when you look at it too, the people that own these apartment buildings or houses
also, in
It's a
addition to
job.
that, also they may not,
It's a tough juggle.
So we have, in addition to the housing action fund, which is about, think of this, about 3 million a year. So if they put 15 aside, we have about, last time I did the math, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 years, assuming that's the case. They're also looking at pledging income from a change in the tourism tax, the room tax, pledging that income to go into it. So that should essentially guarantee us a source of income to replenish the fund. So we can essentially say that we'll have a continuing source of income to replenish the fund. That's the first thing. The second thing is the county at the end of 2022 put 1.5 million in the planning department's budget for an affordable rental upgrade program. That program is rolling out. We have contracts for that program that are just being signed. That program will roll out and help individual landlords, small landlords, have to own less than 8 units countywide, 8 or less units countywide. Small landlords do improvements on their buildings. If they do improvements on their buildings, they need to essentially have a lease. The lease cannot charge more than 80% AMI, and it can or 60% AMI, and we'll give you up to $15,000 a unit for those improvements, or $25,000 if you're at 60%. The rents have to be affordable for 7 years.
how many new units are projected to be added because
No,
of that?
this is an upgrade
This is
program.
So it's only an upgrade.
This is an
So-
upgrade program.
It takes your landlords that don't actually do the right thing and makes them responsible to.
Yes.
Well, it also,
It's a dual-edged sword.
It's accountability,
It
right?
helps out, because we all know, we read the papers, right? You read the papers, you have absentee landlords,
Yep.
don't take care of their property and reap the profits. They do nothing for the people inside, and they keep on paying. On this kind of incentive, that guy can come to the well.
the main thing is I get an upgraded unit that's livable, has to meet all the code, and the rent is locked in for 7 years, right? The other thing is, there's a lot of small landlords out there that have great tenants that are fighting inflation and the cost of improvements, et cetera. It allows them to keep that apartment affordable for a long period of time.
You also have Airbnb, it's also pressing on this, right? Pretty short-term rentals as well, so.
So that's one program. The other program is the state of New York announced a program. We've worked with the state of New York HCR quite a bit. State of New York announced a program. We were one of 2 counties in the state that bit on the program. It's called a +1 program. It is based on the fact that you're going to add an accessory dwelling unit to a house. So this is designed to increase the number of units, whereas the other one was designed to repair units.
Yeah.
This program essentially is not designed in terms of what the unit rents for. It's designed to help low and moderate income homeowners stay in their home, up to $125,000 per unit.
Now,
And is
That's
that,
a 10-year commitment. That's a 10-year commitment.
is that something similar to what town of Rochester is thinking about from an ADU standpoint?
Couldn't tell you. I don't know what they're thinking about. I know the supervisor well, but I don't,
now, Dennis, when you say
yeah.
accessory dwelling, is that falling right in line with short-term rental?
Well,
Yes and no.
You're not gonna be able to
You
do
can't.
that.
They're restricted.
That'll be the
Okay, I was
restriction.
wondering,
It'll
and
be a
then-
rental.
Okay, so that brings me to my last question would be, then in order to qualify for that, you'd also have to register.
Register.
Yeah, you'd have to register the proper way or fill out.
What ends up happening whenever we fund these kinds of things, we take a note and mortgage and file it.
Okay,
So example is, you're a low and moderate income homeowner, you file, you build an ADU, and 2 years later, you sell it, and the guy's making $80 million,
there you go.
you pay us back, right? That's what ends up happening. We take a note and mortgage.
you have
So
some
the
kind
title
of
search
fallback.
finds that
Right,
note and
yeah.
mortgage and goes, what are we doing here? Right.
No, and that increases rental opportunities, which,
Yeah.
you know,
There's different direction a little bit, but, wasn't there some talk about the land bank?
Yes, and here's where we are in land banks. There is a Hennepin County versus Hennepin County case that's out in western the U.S. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court concluded that if you take property for taxes, you can't sell it for a profit. you can sell it, but anything you make over and above the back taxes goes back to the landowner or heirs. So what that did is New York is one of a few states, I think there's 36 states that already do that. New York is one of the few where we take properties and you may owe $20,000 and we get $200,000, right? New York, right now, there's a bill in the state of New York that passed the Senate, passed the Assembly, and the governor hasn't signed it. So the question is, do we actually want to take a property? If we do and we sell it, we'll probably put the work in an escrow account and then wait to see who shows up. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing is that all of this is waiting for essentially some guidance from the state, and the state seems to be stuck on trying to provide guidance. What that means from a land bank perspective is it's going to become very, very expensive for land banks to take property, and or it's going to become expensive for the communities that have land banks to give property to land banks. The current work now is you would give the property to a land bank, the community benefit was affordable housing, the land bank paid $1, right? The county ate a back tax bill, which may be $60,000 or $80,000. Now you're going to eat the back tax bill plus whatever the property is worth. So that's a real drag on that, on the land bank.
I want to be mindful of our time.
Yep.
And I think we have gone a little bit over, but we would love to ask you questions if that's okay going forward as well.
Let me do
Please.
two things. Let me
Yes.
just say two things. One is that we've had a conversation with the prior IDA in terms of what we thought they should be thinking about with respect to pilots, right, and with respect to affordable housing. The first thing I would say, and what we said then and we'll say now, is we believe that 10% affordable units in new construction is achievable without any tax breaks associated with it, right? We believe that if you're going to think about looking at how to incentivize affordability, it should be in the 20% range. Interesting enough, 20% range also kicks off that tax issue that I talked about before, where you have to assess based on the value of the rent, not the value of the building itself. So we think, and in a lot of communities now, I would say there's at least 5 now have a mandatory affordability provision in their zoning statutes. You will build, if you're building 100 units, there's 10 of them going to be affordable. We have several communities that are not participating. Some of those communities have the largest housing problems.
So Dennis, we can set, because the question always comes back, affordable for whom, right? So even within our middle class, if you will, and
Right.
people in the middle, it's affordable based on what their incomes are. So we could set and define what we mean by affordable within those 20% of those
Yep.
units, right?
And the local law that the county passed that got the county involved in housing, and I would suggest you use that, basically is an 80% AMI or below. So the county will be involved in housing if it's 80.
And you have to take into consideration, each municipality has its own AMI. Okay, the city of Kingston is different than the county of Ulster.
I would suggest you use the county AMI.
Yeah.
That's
so
what I
your
would
county has
suggest. That's what I would suggest.
74,000, right? City of Kingston's at 46.
I would suggest you use the county AMI. The other thing I would suggest in terms of pilots, and this goes to your general pilots let me just preface this. In context, the conversations we've had, not successful, but the conversations that we've had relative to the county's involvement in the example, we have an ARPA program that we gave out money for infrastructure. My sense is that we incentivize people that have housing programs in terms of fixing their infrastructure.
We've had that thorough discussion,
The-
and we put it out there. We don't have a lot of people approaching us as far as like a water hookup, your electricity drive, your
Well, we
infrastructure
handed out
work.
several millions of dollars, and what we said is, well, why don't we start with 30% for everybody, and if you have a housing program and a housing smart program, inclusionary zoning, no restrictions on ADUs, available density bonuses for affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you were a housing smart community, we'll give you 50% of the cost. we weren't successful. But it seems odd for me to think about county policy not being implemented through its funding sources. And we've had that conversations with the legislative committee, we've had that conversations with the executive staff, and I don't know where it's coming, but my suggestion would be, from an IDA perspective, if you have a certain amount of things that you're thinking about that you want to incentivize, then do it through how you treat them with respect to the funding source. The last thing I would say to you is that, and this one may, there's an impact when you have a business that creates jobs. There's an impact on housing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So that's.
So
there you go.
my suggestion is, and it has been, and this has been talked about but never actually spoken out loud. My suggestion is that you have a housing impact fee that's associated with your pilots, and they pay it every year.
Absolutely.
All right. You basically start to think, here's your manufacturing pilot. It's $600 whatever it is. The number is right. The housing impact fee based on the number of jobs you're creating is another X amount of dollars that goes into the IDA's housing impact fund, and it's used.
So on that
Go ahead.
note, just one
I
quick
like
question.
that
On a related
way
note,
of-
That's nice.
I was going to ask you something like that. So on a related note, Ulster County Housing Action Fund,
Mm-hmm.
is that something that can be deployed for that? And also, is that coming from infrastructure fund, or is that something separate?
Housing Action Fund is, the county ran a significant amount of fund balance, and it was over and above its fund balance policies to the neighborhood of somewhere in the neighborhood, I would think, between 51 and 61 million, depending upon who you talk to, right? The Housing Action Fund sets aside as an assigned portion of that fund balance to be used for housing. That's all it does. The beauty of that is it carries over from year to year, and we can start to think about what we're going to fund. All of the things you talk about, infrastructure, individual housing units, landlords, et cetera, can be funded through that fund, given the fact that the county now has that local law. We do have, this is very much draft, and I would appreciate if it doesn't get shared outside of this, right? That's a draft that we shared.
Thank you.
That looks at, you need another one? Of what the guidance would be for a housing action fund.
So I know we all agree as the IDA is that, the jobs walk hand in hand with housing. I mean, we can't have housing without jobs, but we can't have jobs without the housing.
How do you attract
So
people
it's
here
the
with
chicken
that?
and the egg,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the problem. And whether or not you put, if you enforce too much of a burden on the developer to come here to incentivize him to build, he kind of walks away. But the other part is, they walk away if the market isn't here for workers, and they look for right away, and you know this probably better than I do, they look right away for availability on housing before they tie their roots.
The interesting conversation that we had with some of the people that have been talking about Ulster County has been their relative housing costs where they're currently located versus the housing cost in Ulster County. Some of that was favorable, some of it wasn't. But it was an interesting conversation that when we've had those conversations, it was interesting to have them in the context of, if I'm going to move my workforce down here, what's the cost of housing? Not the availability, but cost. And the short answer, if they were in a high housing environment, they weren't concerned. If they were in a housing environment that was similar to ours or changing, they were concerned.
And ours is changing as we speak, right?
Well, the answer to that, had you asked me a year ago before the Fed started, they're on number 6, I think, right now. If that was the case, then yes. What's happening now, at least this is my opinion, what's happening now is I think it's moderated because
Financing.
of what the financing costs. That doesn't mean it's not going to continue to go up as you go look at any Zillow report or Realtor report, and it's now into single digits versus double digits.
Dennis, one from my side, one last question, unless anybody else has. For now, I'm sure we'll have more questions. Are there identified sites, or at least a count of those, that may not be greenfield or brownfield, but somewhere in between, where things could take a jump start?
there's, as I said to you, I mean, um, the Housing Smart Community Initiative will work with communities to identify sites. Um, the Ulster County Housing Development Corporation has identified some sites,
That's, yeah.
right? The private sector is finding them all the time.
Yeah, all of it.
Private sector is finding them all the time. As I indicated, we probably have,
The Metro project.
yeah, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of, I would guess, over 1,000 units in various communities, with the bulk of them in Ulster, obviously, because of the gorilla out there.
I got a question if you about it. Who's the housing czar
For,
for Ulster County? I thought you guys were gonna announce a housing czar. Is that how it got
we never,
presented
you
to
know,
us?
I never heard that,
Oh,
but that's
okay.
fine.
Okay.
There was some talk a while back.
Yeah, we're just
There
curious.
was some
Under
consideration.
a different executive.
There was,
We were curious.
so,
We were curious too as a legislative body.
so there, I mean, there's always been this sense, and I take some umbrage at it, that the county never did anything with housing. We were just sort of sitting down there twiddling our thumbs, waiting for Godot.
I heard,
Um,
I heard that rumor.
Yeah. So, we've been investing in housing. I mean, I currently have an $800,000 community development block grant funds that are basically doing housing rehab work. We just completed a $600,000 housing financing program where we provide gap financing for people that are low and moderate income. We provide a gap, so if they get X amount from a bank, we'll give them up to 25. Now it's up to $35,000 to essentially close the deal and do some minor rehab up to $45,000. So
Eliminating PMI or no?
no, what we're trying to do is basically make sure they can actually get the loan. I mean, we can, and the interesting thing, and this is from my perspective, the interesting thing is, who's in the room that I can actually say this?
Well, Bill's not here yet.
No. So the banking community has basically set this out. There are a number of things that I think that the banking community could do that it doesn't do well. And so the conversations we've had, and I think really interesting, is that the new head of economic development has a banking background, and we're looking forward to that. But I think we can engage the banks better than we have as a government.
Would that be
Yeah.
more local banks or?
Yeah, I mean,
There's a lot of mortgages get put through locally. I would say the bulk, higher percentages of people purchasing here, even if they're coming into the community for the first time, they are using local.
yeah,
And so they get a lot of business on sales.
Yeah, I
in
have
this
Ulster
community.
County. I agree with you. I have Ulster Savings Bank, and the reason I ask is because is there something perhaps you're suggesting that there has to be a dialogue in this with banks or financing entities as well?
Let me ask you a question, please. Do you know of any special programs besides first-time hardwire programs that the banks operate? And if the answer to that is no, and you're engaged in economic development activities, I'm engaged in housing activities, then I'm not saying they don't operate those programs. I'm saying if I don't know about them, I would doubt that people are buying houses and thinking about them in that way, that they're aware of them as well. And so one is this, to incentivize the banks to participate, we actually have to engage them, and we really haven't engaged them in any way, shape, or form. They have served on housing advisory committees for us. They've done other types of things for us, and they've been responsive to requests. But I don't think that we've been successful, and I blame that on us, not them, that we've been successful in engaging them to say, what can you do?
What kind of products can you offer that's going to help this situation?
Yeah, and particularly if the county's involved or the IDA is involved and you're sort of backstopping their loan to a certain extent, then it becomes a lot less riskier for them. We've got a lot of eyes on this. The county's involved, the IDA's involved. Where can you participate? And for me, that's a discussion that we haven't had enough of.
It it's an interesting thought. Don't have an opinion on it yet,
Yeah.
but a question again, would something like the Housing Action Fund be available for that as well?
I think that that's where, remember I said this is a catalyst fund. We're not, with the levels of subsidy what we're talking about, we're not going to essentially build units. We're going to incentivize those units. And can we backstop a bank, or can we backstop that loan? I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is yes. If you look at it, as crazy as that organizational chart is for Penrose, I want you to take a look at the capital stack in terms of the sources and funding on those things.
That's the backing.
And that's the backing.
Yeah.
And so when you look at that, then the question is where are we at the local level? And on the smaller deals, I think they can participate.
Yeah, I think that when it comes down to a bank, is the juice worth the squeeze? There you go.
Yep.
But I think you get a little bit of different attitude with more community-minded banks because they are invested in the community, and I think there is opportunity there versus a regional bank.
The other thing I would say is there's a capacity issue that exists with respect to the developers that have been successful in the county. And it's not just helping the private sector. I want you to think about helping the nonprofit sector. We have a phenomenal nonprofit sector, both in Family of Woodstock, Rupco, and others, relative to that. They're facing capacity issues because there's so much in demand. And if you think about that, I mean, Rupco now operates in Orange, Sullivan, Green, and now Dutchess. They have somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 million worth of development proposals in their portfolio. They've just finished up in Newburgh. So when you ask them, what about this? They've always said yes to us, thank God. They've always said yes to us. But there's going to be a time when they can't say yes. And that really scares me. We have not built an organizational infrastructure at the county level to do that kind of work. We've relied on others to do that work. And frankly, that's why we've been so successful. We've literally basically said, we can push paper, but we don't want to hire people to essentially go out in the field and analyze houses. I'll never keep them. They won't stay, right? But Rupco has been really successful at that. Others have been successful. Family of Woodstock can get money from a stone, and they've been great. They've been great partners. They just really have been great partners. Issues here and there, obviously, but they really have been. If you look around Kingston, and say, well, what have we done? Go to Newburgh and ask the Newburgh people, Tannersville, up in those areas. So I want you to think about that nonprofit sector and capacity building. And it's interesting at the state level, the state will give money to open space groups to build capacity. They won't give money to housing groups to build capacity.
Well, that may change, though. I mean, they have to look at things differently.
I think the idea, and I'm sorry, I'll leave this. I know you're busy. I think the other thing I would say to you is that the state of New York is literally in the 18th century when it comes to housing policy. They have been and will be. I mean,
you also have, you take county local took the podium and said, this is what we're going to invest in New York State. Where did that stop? Now you have your NIMBY problem. Okay, so that hits you head on too. Dennis, and that's another big problem that this area has. Not in my backyard. It's not going to happen.
And that's what,
well, the example I would give you is that if you want to open a daycare center, you can override local zoning. The state of New York had a problem with its mental health housing. They basically said, well, I'm really sorry, mental health group homes are no longer subject to local zoning, right? The state of New York had a problem with respect to siting solar facilities. Sorry, large solar facilities are no longer subject to local zoning. We need something at the state level that says, here's your target. If you don't meet it, I don't care what your zoning is.
Right.
We're going to step in and do that kind of work. You talk to consultants that work in the state of New Jersey, and 20% affordability on a project in New Jersey is a requirement. We don't have a long discussion about it. 20% of your units will be affordable.
Yep.
We sit down when the Kingstonian was being developed, we sat down and literally I got beat over the head to get 14 units, which is 10% of the project. And now
Only
that-
you can say that.
But thank you for your time. I am available,
This
if you,
was really helpful.
if you have any questions, I'm available. We'll certainly give you, if you need something, you can take a look at our website. There's stuff out there. I'm more than willing to explain how this works. There are other people I think you should talk to, Kevin O'Connor being one from RUPCO. Really knowledgeable and mission-driven. I mean, we're not talking about, really talking about mission-driven stuff.
I'll call
Thank
you,
you.
Dennis, and thank you for being here. And is it okay to share this draft with our working group? It will not go outside.
It is draft. The
Yep.
legislature has it, but it is draft, and some of that has changed because of the way the resolution, there's an advisory committee that got changed with more appointments from the legislature versus the county executive. So there's some changes to that.
Soon to change again.
I don't know.
Perfect. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yep, take care. Thanks for the time. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
See you again.
Take care.
Sorry, I didn't answer you. My apologies.
All right. Yeah. We can,
I just found that thing that the state could take. It's letter F. It's letter F in the housing policy, just so you know.
and the moratorium?
Huh?
And the moratorium?
Yeah, letter F. You can override anybody's policy.
All right. Unless there is anything to discuss further on this, I think we're good with old business. Any new business that we have? I don't have anything to update at this point.
I guess the only thing I would ask is kind of what the next steps.
So I'm going to reach out to Rashida and Steve and provide them this, but I also would like to have a conversation, and everybody's welcome to join or not. I'd also like to have a conversation with a few other people whom I've already reached out to, Sarah being one that you mentioned from Dutchess County, Sarah Lynn. And I also reached out to Jen Metzger to understand what is the executive's
You may
plan.
want to pick March
And then-
Gallagher's brain a little bit, too.
Then we also reached, Lisa and I already reached out to Marge Gallagher as well. She's going to be available, I think, sometime early September. Yeah, next week. And so those are the three parties I'm going to talk to. If there are any suggestions, I'm happy to reach out there as well and include everybody who would like to be a part of that
Well, I'm
conversation.
just wondering to what end, and why wouldn't we do it within the context of the governance meeting if the whole point here is to gather the information to be able to put together a policy? So having someone go one-off on all these resources, trying to piece it together, why wouldn't we do it as a governance committee?
So that would be my objective, but I wanted to introduce myself first, simply asking them to come by. But we can call them at the next governance meeting,
Line 'em
which,
up.
yeah, exactly.
I would line them up. I mean, I don't know that, I think that just letting them know you're chairing governance and that we're looking at this and we want their input, I think.
No, that's not why I'm introducing myself. I'm introducing because we're working, I don't know if anybody has informed them that we're working on this process.
Of course they
Talked to
know.
Jen a bunch of times.
We've heard it from all of them.
I haven't heard them in the last governance committees, so I didn't know whether we have informed them.
Yeah.
But I'd like to call them as well. But
You can call whoever you want. I'm just saying, if we're talking about groups of people to glean insight and information, just like Dennis, the whole point of having Dennis here was that we're all hearing what his
Ask them
input
questions at
and
once.
ask questions, and yeah, I mean, this is,
I
think,
agree. I
important.
don't want to exclude them. I want to be able to bring somebody who will add. If you think those three factions will add value, I'm happy to just tell them, hey, can you join?
Yeah.
But I don't have set meeting dates with them yet even. So
Yeah,
that's
no,
all.
Yeah, I just said, you said this is who you'd like to talk to, and I think it would be beneficial for the governance.
Oh,
committee
not
to
just
do
me.
that.
I would like to talk to those individuals.
So are you looking to have
And-
another governance meeting?
I think
I
the
think
more
we should
we
have
can
it
have to
in the
keep
next 2
going,
to 3
yeah.
weeks because we have to meet as a board, as a full board, third week of September anyways. So we'll have to have one more. And that's why I'm trying to.
Yes, and I mean, just I'm here, I mean, if we can work it out. Lisa, if you could do magic and try to figure out, if we get all three of them here on a certain, I
That
possible,
might,
but,
yeah.
but you never know until you ask and see, they can,
So who do you have in the queue? Who are you thinking in the queue?
I was thinking March and June. Sarah, I want to talk to because they have already implemented policy, and we talked about it too.
Sarah's well versed on it.
why we have her here then?
Yeah.
She's
We
very
got-
well versed.
well,
Last time she was here that was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago,
A
but
long
it'd be
time
great
ago.
to have her here.
Well,
She's
and
wonderful.
probably back then they were implementing new things, and it would be great to hear what's worked, what hasn't.
She did. She
As you
just
go
started
through
kicking
this,
that off.
right?
They just did that, yeah.
Go through that.
She was
So-
great, we had her here
Okay.
a lot.
So I think that could be invaluable.
You know, it's, you know, Dutchess County is, you know, they're pretty cut and dry on how they handle it.
Yep.
If the municipality approves it and the taxing jurisdictions, to go.
Listen, Jen Metzger, March Gallagher, and those two know that we have a moratorium on housing and it's in governance hands, and we've been communicating that for the last year. So I think it's pretty clear that we're working on this and trying to get,
But I also think it's important, and we haven't asked a lot of this, well, since I've been here, what are they looking for from us?
Right.
I want to understand in their minds what they feel we can do. And then, because it just
Who,
helps
the
to
municipality?
The municipal,
No,
No.
the county exec, the controller.
Oh, okay.
because
You know, because everybody's got a different opinion.
Yeah. No, you're right.
You know
Even
what
the
you could do?
conversation here, this is all beneficial, because it's informing where people are coming at this and what direction they're coming
And the
at
other
it.
thing about that too, we all hear at the same time, like I was trying to hear from him, like where's the gap?
Yep.
Like if we can fill gaps, if he's got some things and Jen's got things going, March has got, like where are the holes and where are the gaps? And
I-
where,
He gave us a
where-
little bit, but he's not so direct,
No,
so,
he's not.
so
So-
you gotta pull it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, I think it would be great to hear from him.
Yeah.
You know, his, I think 80% is where he
Yeah.
stood his ground going
Yeah.
back at 60. I would say anything above 80 to 110 is the gap, because 120 is considered market rate. You know, that's what I was driving at, like,
Where
give
is
me
the-
number for market rate?
Yeah,
I
he
think
can't give you
I
that.
base it on 120, you know,
Yeah.
because 120, nobody needs anything, but I'm not saying 110 is not that number either, so I think the gap would be anywhere between 80 and whatever on that end, you know, but I think you brought it up, Diane, about, you know, what was the percentage of the 80 or 60, what do we do, you know?
Yeah.
I
Yeah, 80
do-
or 60 can't afford even the 500,000.
No, and there's a
So
new
that's what I'm
category.
saying,
That's why.
That's where we've
affordable
gotta
for who?
put-
We
yeah.
have to
Yeah.
define affordable
that's,
because
I
it's
keep going back to
It's
that.
the middle that's getting squeezed.
Yep,
It's
they're
not the top
squeezed.
end, it's not the
And-
bottom, it's
Although there
everybody
are
in the middle.
issues happening at the bottom end on the affordable side with the tickets, without being able to find
But
rentals, et
yes,
cetera.
that is true, if you've got that.
So,
at
but
least
that-
the
but
money's
that-
pouring
but
in there and
that-
they've got their eye on it.
Well, that's their issue to try and resolve, but we can't tackle everything.
And you know what, that's also where the towns push back the hardest on
Yeah.
low-income housing.
Yeah.
And the
They
other
don't
problem
want it
is
in their
once you figure on, we're only gonna help, hypothetical situation, we're only gonna help 80%, 60% of the AMI, what you do is you distance your developer,
That's right.
because why is he coming? We got, you know, this is a tricky thing right here, you know? You've gotta draw a developer in, okay, and also tell him,
But you
This
know
is
what,
where
I
you're
don't
at.
have a problem saying to the developer, you wanna do market rate, fine, but you're gonna have to do this percentage of workforce housing, and we'll help you with that.
and
But
that's,
we're not gonna help you
And
with the market rate.
That's what we
That's
discussed,
exactly-
yeah.
we've
So-
done that before.
Yeah,
That's
I
how
mean,
we-
I
that's-
think there's ways of
Yeah.
tackling
Yeah,
that
yeah,
and
And it's
still
just
making
alluded
it.
to, you got beat over the head, you know, so.
Talked about the last government, the but for. There's a lot here that there's no need for, a but for does not work. But if there's part of it, you know, that,
The but, you know, we had a project in the queue down there that was gonna take place in Marlboro, and that's being built. That's going. So the but just fell into play on that one, on all that.
So they obviously didn't need
they
it.
didn't need it.
So all I'm saying
That's
is
what I
that,
understand.
That's
yeah,
the point.
all I'm saying is
Yeah.
that I think there's ways we can be creative about it, but it shouldn't be incentivizing market housing, it should be
Oh,
incentivizing
no,
workforce
you know
housing.
what, I've always stood by that too, you know,
Okay.
you
Okay,
know,
I just
private
wanna make
housing,
sure it's just being
$700,000 house, how do you
Yeah,
throw that
you
on the
can
backs of
afford that,
everybody?
forget
You know,
it,
I
right.
get that.
Imagine
to go, it's 10%, right, affordable inside these units, okay, like Dennis said. Dennis believes the number really should be 20. I don't
We
know.
should make it 20.
You may be able to, you're right, this,
And we'll help you with that
But I'm gonna-
20%, but
Correct.
we're not gonna help you with the
But I'm
market
gonna-
rate.
I'm
You're gonna
gonna-
make it yourself.
the other 80 may be on you, you know, I mean, and then you've gotta deal with, well, do they really wanna come in here and go through this process, you know, for whatever. But, you know what,
And I
that's
think-
on them.
If that can make the deal, cause you know, they all bring in their balance sheets in here and they give us a, you know, I've been through enough smoke and mirrors on a number of projects about how, and I get how it works, but all I'm saying is that, you know, let's be clear what we will incentivize and what we won't.
I agree.
I'm just gonna say this, we did some project at 10% affordable, right? We did there was a 10%, but it really wasn't affordable.
No.
And that's where I don't, 10%, 20%,
You know, what's nice
okay, but
about
you've
getting
gotta
in-
define that.
Yeah.
Involved where you say 20, 10%, whatever. Being a partner in that project, we have control over monitoring that with a clawback provision. And listen, that clawback's really no joke.
No, not when you're talking about the build-out, the improvements to the
Throwing
land
you
and the
back on
cost,
that tax roll?
and then having to refinance because you're doing a
Right.
clawback. They're
Lot of
not gonna,
legwork.
nobody's gonna like that.
That's right,
So,
I agree.
I think
I think we're in agreement.
I think
on
we're talking about the
direction.
same thing. In fact, last time when we met, we had discussed similar aspects as well, given the UTAP uniformity. Once the definitions are in, I think we'll have to think about affordability then, because 10%, 20%, we'll have to decide on what the affordability number is. And
You
we
know,
can
he
talk
gave
to,
He gave you a pretty good spot on
He
the
did.
sheet.
Hey, that
Okay,
HUD
I
sheet
got it
is
'cause
the
that's the one
perfect.
I have in my files,
Yes,
okay?
this is
that's
good.
2023, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Anything we have to match, well, anyway, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, I was simply going to say, we'll provide this to the housing workforce, so the group that we're talking to, Steve and Rashida. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have one of them here today. But I'll coordinate with them. If there's anything else that I think, or you think that we should be doing, let me know, both including inviting somebody or any type of information that we need.
So I
You
think
know-
Jen, March,
March.
and Sarah are the
Yeah.
three we
You know,
should
Chair,
go
I
with.
agree with Lynn too. At what point do you just go, okay, you know, we've got it all, you know?
I think it's important too, though, that these are people we want to hear from, and
Oh,
they
no.
need to be felt that they're being.
They've been heard,
It's
yeah.
been a
And
long
that,
time.
and where we go, and I think this is, I think this is an important next step, and I think we can make it happen
Yeah.
before the meeting, and I think just now our conversation helped to solidify some of the things that we're agreeing to, that we
Yeah.
have agreement on. And what, you know, how does that, you know, Diane, you said something that, you know, even once we start to put it down, we've got some data now to put, you know, start to see what we can develop as a policy, is like, can we play it out? Can we take a scenario and say, what are they gonna do, and, you know, if this is a project, maybe even one of our old projects, and apply the new UTEP? What would have changed?
What would have looked like, yeah.
Yeah, what would have looked like, what would have happened?
Would they have had more point, yeah.
All right, so next
Yeah.
step, I agree,
Does that
we'll
make
have,
sense to you, Mike?
Oh, yeah, overlap it and take a good look.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've only have,
Test it out.
there's only several that we have that we can use.
Right,
But
but it's
still,
still.
you're correct, overlay them and go, you want to know something, too bad that wasn't back then.
Because we would have done this.
this, yeah.
Exactly.
And you want to know something,
It's just scenario.
what, Lynn, you brought
Yeah.
the term to the committee, the best everywhere, you know, with the board was, living, breathing documents. I mean, let's put it, this is all subject, when you get this off the ground, you know it's gonna be tweaked and amended and moved and to see what works for it.
You're channeling Jimmy now.
You know, wanna know something, you really, you're gonna take that project, you know,
Yeah.
and you're gonna have to, at one point, we're gonna have to pick a project, and we're gonna have to get our feet wet,
Yep.
no matter what happens,
Yeah.
and you're gonna jump right in. And then you wanna know something, maybe a year from now.
We might have to revise
send
it.
where you can
Yes.
fall back.
We learned something that says we should have tweaked this a little bit differently, and that's why, not in the process, not while you're going through approval, though.
All
That
right.
is the one thing I think is
You know
absolutely
what?
critical
The King's
not to
City is a
do.
gift that keeps on giving to us, Mike.
Hopefully we can learn from it.
Yeah.
All right,
It's
Yeah,
funny.
absolutely.
so no new
People
business,
there fighting over
yes.
giant scissors. The
no new business. We would like to adjourn, so can I request a motion, please? Motion. Second? All in favor? Aye. All right, everybody. It's August 29, 12:30. I'd like to call to order the meeting for Ulster County Capital Resource Corporation Governance Committee. Roll call. Costa Bahal present. Lynn.
Here.
Dr. Diane Arch.
Present.
All right. And let the record note that Mr. Mike Ham is here as well. May I request a review of the minutes, which I believe are the same as minutes for UCIDA, and we should amend that for the addition of UTAP that we had discussed during the last governance committee. Any other additions or deletions?
No.
Okay. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes, please?
I'll make the motion. Second.
All in favor? With those amendments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Old business, please reflect it's the same as the UCIDA meeting, and no new business at this time. May I request a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Adjourned.